The early morning fog was just beginning to lift, casting an eerie glow over the small run-down strip of shops nestled along the edge of town. The world still felt heavy with the remnants of the night, the air thick with the scent of wet pavement and the distant hum of early traffic. The storefronts, some half dilapidated and others freshly painted in a desperate attempt to catch attention, stood as silent witnesses to the lives that cycled through them. But among these buildings was one that seemed to defy the monotony. Tasha's Corner, the faded sign above the door read, proudly proclaiming a safe space for anyone looking to escape the noise and judgment of the world outside. Inside, the shop was warm and inviting, a haven of vibrant colors, shelves lined with homemade soaps, candles, and books of every genre. The air smelled faintly of lavender and cinnamon, mixed with the earthy aroma of freshly brewed coffee that wafted from the back. It was a place that, on the surface, seemed to have no trouble attracting the community's steady stream of regulars, weary office workers stopping for a quick pick-me-up, teenagers eager to pass the time, and the occasional lone wanderer looking for some quiet in their otherwise chaotic life. Behind the counter, Tasha was busy organizing a stack of papers, her broad frame leaning forward as she adjusted the glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She moved with purpose, her hands steady and practiced, despite the quiet ache in her bones. Tasha had always been a woman of resilience, a trait that had served her well both during her years in the army and now in civilian life. The battle scars from both worlds were etched into her body. Her thick, muscular arms were the product of years of service, a life she had once lived without question. But now, the weight of her past often felt heavier than any physical burden. There were days when the memories haunted her, when the quiet of the shop did little to drown out the distant echoes of her former life. Yet here she was, creating a space for others to find peace. As she folded the last of the paperwork, she glanced out the window. The sunlight was starting to break through the mist, casting a soft glow over the street. It was in this fleeting moment of calm that she noticed the two figures across the road. They were standing just outside the alley, their postures too rigid, their eyes too intent as they watched her shop. Tasha's brow furrowed, a flash of unease creeping up her spine. She wasn't one to be paranoid, but something about the way they stood there, like they were waiting for something, set her instincts on edge. It wasn't unusual for strangers to pass through, but these two felt different. They didn't belong here. Her eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, noting that her shift was nearly over. The shop was quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps outside or the distant hum of traffic. Tasha took a deep breath, reminding herself to shake off the tension, but just as she turned to grab her purse, the door to the shop swung open with a jarring force. The bell above the door rang out sharply, its sound unsettling in the otherwise peaceful atmosphere. 3 men entered, their presence immediately commanding the space. The first was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. The second had a more wiry build, his features sharp and calculating, his eyes scanning the room like a predator searching for its prey. The third, a stocky man with a dark, weathered face, stood just inside the door, a look of cold superiority radiating from him. They were dressed casually, but their demeanor, too stiff, too deliberate, spoke volumes. They weren't here for a cup of coffee or a book. No, they had come for something else. Tasha straightened, her muscles instinctively tensing. She had dealt with trouble before, too many times to count. But something about these men felt different. The air around her shifted, heavy with the weight of unspoken intentions. She set her purse down, her eyes narrowing as she watched them carefully. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. The tall man nodded, his lips curling into a thin, almost mocking smile. "Just a little business," he said, his voice low and grating. "We're here for something valuable. You wouldn't mind handing it over, would you?" The words hit her like a slap in the face. For a split second, she felt her heart race, her mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. Business. What were they talking about? Her eyes flicked to the door, calculating her options. She didn't want to escalate things, but her mind was already shifting into a different mode, one she had hoped to leave behind. She had been trained to react swiftly, to survive in situations like this. But those years, buried deep under the layers of her new life, were creeping back to the surface. Valuable? I don't know what you're talking about, Tasha said, her voice calm, though the flicker of tension in her chest was undeniable. The wiry man took a step forward, his gaze narrowing. Don't play coy with us. We know what's in here. His eyes scanned the shelves, as if searching for something specific, but Tasha could feel the weight of his stare, like he wasn't just looking for items, he was assessing her. She swallowed hard, but her hand stayed steady at her side. There was something about these men that felt wrong, like they didn't belong here, not just in her shop, but in this town, in her life. As the silence stretched, the stocky man's hand slid into his jacket and Tasha's instincts flared. She knew the move. She had seen it before. But before she could react, a loud crash erupted from the back of the shop, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Tasha's heart stopped for a moment, her gaze snapping toward the sound. Her instincts kicked in, but it was too late. Tasha's gaze snapped back to the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of breaking glass had come from the back storage area where she kept her extra stock. It was faint, but unmistakable. Her first instinct was to move, rush to the back, assess the situation. But she held herself still. No one could know the soldier within her that never truly left. Years in the army had ingrained a certain sense of calm in her, even when panic would have been the easier response. But as much as she hated to admit it, the nerves were still there. After all, leaving the army hadn't been an easy decision. Tasha had once been one of the Army's elite rangers, a force to be reckoned with, a woman whose sharp instincts and razor-focused dedication had earned her respect and fear in equal measure. She had served for nearly 15 years, the camaraderie with her fellow soldiers replacing the need for a family. But the war, the constant loss, had begun to wear on her. She had seen too much, lost too much, and eventually she realized she was becoming a ghost of the woman she once was. The hardest part wasn't walking away from the battlefield, it was realizing that she didn't know who she was without it. She didn't know how to exist in a world that didn't need her anymore. So she came back here, to this small town, this little shop, and tried to put her pieces back together. Tasha's life now was quieter, slower, and yet the weight of her past had never truly lifted. The relationships she had with the people in her town were all shaped by the woman she used to be. They knew she had been in the military, but most didn't know the full extent of it. They didn't know that in many ways she was still fighting, battles that no one could see. Behind the counter of her shop, she tried to pretend she was just like everyone else. She was Tasha, the woman who made candles, soaps, and the occasional batch of jam that no one seemed to stop talking about. She was a small business owner now, a far cry from the world she once knew. But every now and then, the truth crept in, and she found herself reliving moments that never seemed to leave her. "Hey, you okay?" It was Devonte, one of her regulars, a soft-spoken young man in his 20s, who came in most days for a cup of coffee and a few minutes of quiet. He'd grown up in the town, worked a series of odd jobs, and had recently started helping her around the shop. Tasha had taken him under her wing, watching him struggle through life in much the same way she had once struggled. He reminded her of the younger version of herself, before the army, before the hardships. She forced a smile, not wanting to worry him. "Yeah, just a little jumpy today. It's nothing." Devonte raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "You sure?" "I've Seen you face down some pretty tough situations, but today you seem different. Tasha's eyes flicked to the door where the men were standing, still staring at her, and she knew she couldn't keep up the pretense any longer. "There's something off about them," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Devonte's gaze followed hers, his posture stiffening. "What do you mean? They don't look like they belong." Tasha didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The air in the room had thickened, and Devonte could feel it too. He looked toward the back door, then back to her, his eyes wide. "Are you gonna do something?" Tasha hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to keep calm, to take stock of the situation before making a move. But the tension in the room was suffocating, and she knew this moment was too important to ignore. She took a deep breath and then nodded, her decision made. The situation could escalate, and if she didn't act now, things might spiral out of control faster than she could handle. But before she could move, the stocky man, the one who had been lingering by the door, took a deliberate step forward, his eyes narrowing as he addressed her. "I think it's time we had a little chat," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Hand over the goods." Tasha felt the weight of the words settle in her chest, a sense of danger that she could almost taste in the air. The goods. What were they talking about? She had nothing in the back of the store that could be of any value to these men. She glanced at the shelves, her mind racing. She had no idea what they were after, but it was clear that this wasn't a simple robbery. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tasha replied, her voice steady but her hand brushing against the edge of the counter, ready to take action if needed. "Now, you need to leave." The wiry man smirked, stepping forward to block her exit. "I don't think you understand, lady. You're not in charge here. We know exactly what you have, and we're not leaving until we get it." Tasha's mind raced as she scanned the situation, her pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. These men weren't just after money or goods. There was an underlying intent, something darker. Her military training kicked in, her brain running through possible scenarios and outcomes, all while she kept her face impassive, as though she wasn't being backed into a corner. Behind her, Devonte's nervous energy was palpable, but he stayed, silent, his trust in Tasha clear. She had to make a move, and quickly, but before she could take the next step, a loud crash came from the back, followed by a muffled yell. It was unmistakable now. The men had already made their move. They were inside the back storage room. Tasha's heart dropped into her stomach. She had to act, but she couldn't risk her safety or Devonte's on a blind charge. "What's going on back there?" Devonte asked, his voice tight with fear. Tasha didn't answer. She was already moving toward the back, her mind working through strategies, calculating the risks and choosing the best moment to strike. But the moment she reached the door, a sharp voice called from behind her. "Don't even think about it," the stocky man warned. Tasha froze, her fingers gripping the handle of the back door. She didn't need to turn around to know they were watching her, waiting for her next move. She could feel the weight of their eyes, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. For a moment, everything was still. Then from the back room there was another crash, louder this time, followed by a voice she didn't recognize. "Who the hell are you people?" The words hung in the air, thick with tension, as Tasha's heart hammered in her chest. She knew now that this was no ordinary confrontation. This was something else entirely. The muffled crash from the back room echoed louder this time, a sign that the situation had escalated. Tasha's fingers gripped the handle of the door, her breath shallow as she processed what was unfolding. Every cell in her body screamed at her to act, but a cold, calculated voice inside reminded her to wait. One wrong move could turn this from a tense encounter to a nightmare. She steeled herself, pushing the door open just enough to peer into the back. From where she stood, she could see that the storage room had been turned upside down. Shelves were knocked over, boxes were scattered across the floor, and the back, Window was shattered, a jagged hole where glass had once been. The men were no longer just standing around. They were moving with purpose now, rifling through the crates of supplies that Tasha had carefully stored away over the last few months. But it wasn't just the mess that made her stomach twist with fear. It was the realization that they were getting closer to what they'd been looking for. Tasha's shop was much more than a simple corner store. She had invested her heart and soul into it, but hidden deep in one of the crates was something more dangerous. A box of military-grade equipment she'd never intended to use. Again, her time in the Army Ranger Division was full of missions that required her to stash away resources for the right moment. But once she left the service, the right moment never came. She had locked those items away, hoping she would never have to use them again. And now, these men were on the brink of finding them. If they did, she could lose everything. They would. Have access to a cache of dangerous tools, the kind that could cause untold damage if they were to fall into the wrong hands. She needed to stop them, but she also knew that getting caught in the act would be her end. There was too much at stake. Tasha glanced over her shoulder at Devonte, who had moved closer to the counter, clearly shaken by the scene unfolding before him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. She could see him trembling slightly, but he wasn't backing down. He was there for her, just like he always had been. She didn't want him to get hurt, but it wasn't just his safety she had to consider anymore. The stakes had changed. Her heartbeat quickened, and the air seemed to thicken around her as her body tensed, ready for what was coming. The stocky man, the one who had been blocking the door, grunted as he rifled through one of the crates. His eyes were wild with impatience, his movements rough as though he couldn't stand to waste another second. His patience was wearing thin. "I told you," he growled. "We know what's here. Hand it over." Tasha's voice came out low but firm. "I don't know what you think you're looking for, but you need to leave. Now." The wiry man, who had been silently observing, shifted his weight and stepped forward, his hand reaching for something in his pocket. Tasha's heart skipped a beat as her mind flashed back to her training. She couldn't afford to hesitate. The old soldier instincts kicked in, her body moving before she could think, muscles rippling with the force of years of combat experience. Before she could reach the back room, the wiry man drew out a blade, a gleaming, curved knife that he had twirled between his fingers like a toy. His smirk was cruel, the tension in his gaze unmistakable. "You're going to make this difficult, huh?" he said, taking a deliberate step toward her. Tasha's hand instinctively moved to the edge of the counter, her fingers brushing the edge of a heavy metal object that she kept for self-defense. A flash of memory hit her, years of training, years of surviving brutal combat in the worst conditions, years of being in situations like this where every second mattered. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was her life, her business, the only thing she had left. "Put the knife down," she ordered, her voice unwavering. But inside, the nerves were beginning to take hold. The memory of her fallen comrades haunted her as she stood her ground. She'd always been the one to save others. Could she do it again? Could she protect what little she had left? "You think you're in control here?" The wiry man's voice was mocking, and his eyes glinted with malice. "You're just a woman running a small shop. What can you do?" That was when she heard it, a faint shuffle of footsteps from the back room, a second set of voices now rising. In a heated exchange, Tasha's pulse quickened. Someone else was back there, someone who wasn't part of the gang. She couldn't make out their words, but it didn't take a genius to realize that the man who'd yelled earlier wasn't backing down. They were going to fight. For a moment, Tasha stood frozen, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. Then just as quickly, the flood of memories hit her. "Stay strong, girl." Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a memory from the days before she joined the military. He'd always told her to stand her ground, never to let fear control her. He had been a mechanic, tough as nails and fiercely protective of his family. It was his words that had driven her to the army, that had pushed her to become something. More than just the girl who lived in a small town. She had wanted to prove something, to herself, to him, to the world, and now, standing in her shop with danger closing in, she needed that same strength. She needed the resolve that had once kept her alive in 1,000 impossible situations. She needed to remember that she wasn't just Tasha, the woman who ran a shop. She was Tasha, the army ranger. The wiry man lunged at her, but she was ready. She sidestepped the strike, using his momentum against him. Her hand shot out, grabbing the knife from his grip and twisting it out of his reach in one smooth motion. His eyes widened in surprise as he stumbled backward. But just as quickly the stocky man grabbed her from behind, his heavy arms locking around her chest in a bear-like grip. "Gotcha now," he snarled. Tasha's heart raced as she struggled, her body instinctively trying to break free. She could hear the clink of weapons and the low murmur of voices from the back room, but there was no time to focus on them now. She had to deal with this threat first. Her muscles tensed, and she drove her elbow into the man's gut, using his own weight against him to twist out of his grasp. The move was precise, practiced, but even as she freed herself, the stocky man recovered quickly, slamming his fist into her side with a brutal force that knocked the wind from her lungs. For a brief, terrifying moment, she felt the weight of exhaustion drag at her body. She had been on edge for too long. The stress, the constant strain of being ready for anything was finally taking its toll, but she wouldn't give up. Not now, not when everything was on the line. Just as the stocky man closed in again, Devante's voice cut through the air. "Tasha, watch out!" Out of the corner of her eye, Tasha saw movement in the back room. Someone she hadn't expected, stepped into the doorway. A tall figure, wearing dark clothes, their face obscured by a mask. Tasha didn't have time to analyze who they were, but their presence was enough to make the stocky man hesitate, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "What the hell?" the wiry man muttered. "Who are you?" Tasha's heart skipped a beat. This new figure's arrival had thrown off the entire dynamic. Was this someone who was here to help, or was it just another player in the game? The tension ratcheted up as the mystery surrounding this new figure lingered in the air, and all Tasha could do was wait and wonder how this new development would change everything. The room seemed to close in on Tasha, the air thick with the acrid scent of sweat and fear. Her heart was hammering in her chest, her breath coming in short gasps as she fought to maintain control of the chaos unfolding around her. The stocky man's grip on her was relentless, each breath she took tightening her ribs as she struggled to break free. Her mind raced, calculating her next move, but everything felt hazy, as though she were underwater. The wiry man had taken a step back, eyeing the newcomer in the doorway, his expression flickering between confusion and suspicion. Tasha's head was spinning, her body aching from the fight, but she couldn't allow herself to focus on anything other than the task at hand. She had trained for moments like this. She had survived too much to let fear or fatigue take hold now. The stakes were too high. The stocky man growled, tightening his grip around her waist as he attempted to force her to the ground. Tasha's instincts kicked in. She shifted her weight, bringing her elbow back into his side with a sharp jab that sent him stumbling. She moved quickly, her hand reaching for the counter beside her. Her fingers closed around the metal object she'd left there for emergencies. In one fluid motion, she swung it behind her, connecting with the man's arm. He hissed in pain, releasing her for just a second, but it was enough. Tasha pushed herself forward, spinning on her heel to face him. She was breathing heavily now, every muscle screaming in protest, but she couldn't stop. Her mind was clear, the panic ebbing away as the old soldier within her took charge. She knew how to handle this. She had been trained for far worse. But just as she was about to make her next move, a voice cut through the noise, a sharp, cutting tone that sent a chill down her spine. Enough! The voice was cold, commanding. The newcomer in the doorway stepped forward, and Tasha's gaze locked onto the figure. Tall, dark clothes, face obscured by a mask, the figure moved with precision, as if every action had been calculated, every step planned. The tension in the room ratcheted up, the atmosphere thick with hostility. "Who the hell are you?" the wiry man asked, his voice laced with disbelief. The figure didn't respond immediately. They simply surveyed the scene, their eyes flicking from Tasha to the two men standing by her. The stocky man was still recovering from Tasha's blow, but his posture had changed. He was clearly more cautious now, the arrogance from earlier replaced by uncertainty. "Move aside," the figure said, their voice low and chilling. The wiry man didn't budge. "You think we're just going to let you walk in and—" Before he could finish, the newcomer moved like a blur. There was no hesitation, no second thought. With a swift, almost inhuman movement, the figure closed the distance between them and knocked the knife from the wiry man's hand. The blade clattered to the floor, and in the same fluid motion, the figure grabbed the man by the throat, lifting him off the ground with ease. The wiry man's eyes bulged in panic, his hands clawing at the arm that held him in place. The stocky man roared in fury, moving to help his partner, but Tasha was quicker. Her legs burned as she pushed herself forward, slamming into the stocky man with all the force she could muster. He stumbled back, surprise flashing in his eyes for a brief moment. It was enough for Tasha to get in close, driving her knee into his stomach. The air rushed out of him, and for a moment he was winded, leaving him vulnerable. "Who are you?" Tasha finally managed to ask, her voice hoarse but demanding. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they dropped the wiry man to the ground with a thud and turned their gaze back to Tasha, their eyes sharp and calculating. "Not important right now," they said, their voice clipped, almost robotic. "We need to get you out of here." Tasha's mind was racing. She didn't trust them, couldn't trust them, but they were her only shot at survival. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she spat, glancing back at the two men who were regaining their footing. "They're not going to stop. They're after something bigger than you or me." The newcomer's eyes flicked to the men and then back to her. "Doesn't matter. We need to go." Tasha's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea what this person was after, but she knew one thing for sure. This was only going to get worse. The tension in the room was unbearable. She could feel the stocky man's rage building as he regained his footing, his hands flexing as if he were about to explode. She couldn't afford to waste another second. Her survival depended on it. "Run," the figure said, giving her a sharp nod. Tasha didn't hesitate this time. She turned and sprinted for the door, her legs burning with effort. Behind her, she could hear the men shouting, cursing, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to look back. Every muscle screamed in protest as she pushed herself harder, faster. The back door loomed ahead, and just as she reached it, she felt a hand grab her arm. For a split second, terror flooded through her veins until she turned and saw it was the figure pulling her away from the shop and toward the alleyway. "We're not safe yet," they muttered, urgency in their voice. "We need to move now." Tasha's pulse hammered in her ears as they fled down the alley, the sounds of their pursuers growing fainter but not gone. She could hear the stocky man shouting commands, his anger evident. They were close. She could feel it in her bones. But even as she ran, the questions in her mind only grew. Who was this person? Why had they come for her? And why hadn't they just let her handle it on her own? They turned a corner, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Tasha allowed herself to breathe, her chest heaving with exhaustion. But the moment of respite was short-lived. "Wait," Tasha said, halting suddenly. The figure didn't stop, but they turned to look at her. "What's going on? Who are you? And why are you helping me?" The figure's gaze softened, just for a moment, but the coldness never fully left their expression. "I'm not your enemy, Tasha, but I'm not here for charity either. You're not the only one they've been watching." Before she could respond, a sound sliced through the air, distant but unmistakable. Tires screeching against asphalt, the sound of an engine revving too loudly. A car. They were close. Tasha's blood ran cold. "They're coming." The figure nodded. "We need to move fast." Tasha turned to run again, but before she could take a step, a voice called from behind her. "Tasha!" It was Devonte's voice, panic laced through every syllable. She spun around, her heart skipping a beat. As she saw him emerging from the alley behind her, his face pale, his breath coming in shallow bursts. "Get down!" she shouted, pushing him into the shadows just as the roar of an engine grew louder. And then, with terrifying speed, a black SUV screeched into view, its headlights blinding. The sound of tires skidding against the wet pavement filled the night. As it came to a screeching halt in front of them, the door swung open and two men, familiar faces, stepped out, their cold eyes locked on Tasha, the stocky man and the wiry one from the shop. But they weren't alone. Behind them a third figure emerged, someone far larger, far more intimidating. The air was thick with tension. They had Tasha cornered. The figure beside her shifted, their body tense, preparing for what was to come. But Tasha couldn't look, away from the faces of the men in front of her. The true enemy was still a mystery, and now she was about to find out why they were after her.